Hi, welcome to Deepfakery, a new web series of critical conversations exploring art, human rights, journalism, and deepfakes, all in a time of infodemics. I'm Kat Cizek. I'm the artistic director of the co-creation studio at MIT Open Documentary Lab.
And I'm Corin Fife, program coordinator for emerging threats and opportunities at Witness. For those new to the series and to Witness, we're a human rights organization that works with people who use video and technology to secure social justice. And we've recently led a series of the first global expert meetings looking at the threats to civic activists and journalists from deepfakes, which took place in Brazil, South Africa, and Malaysia. And you can find out more about that at witness.org.
This series is a special joint presentation between our two groups, and the series is supported by the Knight Foundation along with our media partners BuzzFeed and Vimeo. Co-Creation Studio at MIT Open Documentary Lab is a hub for emergent tech and media in art, documentary, and journalism, and especially in co-creative methodologies. For those of you who are not so familiar with deepfakes, we're talking about new ways to use artificial intelligence to make it look like somebody said something or did something that they never did by swapping their faces, simulating their voices, or manipulating scenes. Today's episode is called Boundary Lines, Deepfakes Weaponized Against Journalists and Activists. And we've got an amazing panel of women. We've got guests Samantha Cole, Nina Schick, and Megha Rajagopalan in conversation with journalist and filmmaker Assia Boundaoui of the award-winning film, The Feeling of Being Watched. And Assia is also our new co-creation journalism fellow at the studio. They're going to talk for about 30 minutes, and we'll have time for your Q&As, questions. So please do drop them into your social channels, and we'll pick them up and bring them in towards the end of the show. Enjoy, and I'm really honored to introduce you to Assia Boundaoui, who's going to moderate today's conversation.
Thank you, Kat. I'm really excited to be here and be in conversation with these incredible journalists and writers. Today, we're happy to have with us Samantha Cole from VICE News, Megha Rajagopalan from BuzzFeed News, and author Nina Schick. And we're thrilled to have all of you guys watching and listening in. We're going to dive into a conversation about the weaponizing of deepfakes and how that plays out in the lives of women and the ways that can compromise the work of journalists and activists around the world. So let's start with Samantha Cole. Samantha is a Brooklyn-based journalist at Motherboard, Vice's science and technology outlet. She covers the worlds of online sexuality, sex tech, and the adult industry. So Samantha, in 2017, you famously broke the story on deepfakes with the article, AI-assisted fake porn is here and we're all effed. In it, you wrote that aside from the technical challenge, all someone would need is enough images of your face, and many of us are already creating sprawling databases of our own faces. It isn't difficult to imagine an amateur programmer running their own algorithm to create a sex tape of someone they want to harass. So in 2017, you started identifying really early on this fear that deepfakes would be used for the creation of non-consensual porn. I mean, that was their origin, right? That it would be used as revenge porn, as blackmail against women. Nearly 3 years later, what have you found? Who is being generally targeted by deepfakes and how?
So just as you were saying, the beginnings of deepfakes origin was in making celebrity porn. So it started in a forum where people were already pasting celebrity women's faces onto porn performers' nudes and bodies, and that was using Photoshop with static images, and deepfakes took it a step further and used algorithms to actually put the faces in the videos and make them move. So yeah, that was kind of the origins of it. And, the people that I talked to who were making them at the time, called it a hobby. A lot of them said, they weren't like machine learning, like experts or programmers. They were just practicing what they thought was like a new cool tech. And a lot of people still see it that way. And I think that there are uses for it that are just honing some skills in AI, but those origins ignored that no one in these videos gave consent to be in them. It ignored the consent of the sex workers whose work was being stolen and spread just like it always is online. And it ignored the consent of the women who didn't want, what seemed like sex tapes of them published on the internet. So yeah, that was the origins. And then studies have found just since then that, that was 2.5, 3 years ago, that even now it's still prolific uses in porn mostly. There are like the funny ones that show up on YouTube of like people coming on Conan as like a different face impersonating. But most of the deepfakes that exist online today are still targeting women in porn.
And I want to talk a little bit about harm because, there's something interesting in your writing, like over the last 3 years, you're covering the deepfakes and the evolution of them. And there's a refrain, there's a sort of frustrated refrain in your articles that comes up over and over again. This idea that a lot of the buzz and hysteria around deepfakes has relegated itself to the hypothetical use of political deepfakes, right, in elections, et cetera. Something that you write hasn't actually happened yet. But there are hundreds of thousands of examples of deepfakes and manipulated images that are used to target, harass, defame, and just, use women's images without consent. So can you talk a little bit about that? The fact that, it's been used specifically in a gendered way that has targeted women, and that doesn't seem to get people as riled up as the hypothetical use of it in other ways. Can you speak to that kind of frustration that I picked up on in your articles?
Sure. Yeah. You're right that it is a frustration. It's a frustration that comes from just, being a woman online, I think, which I think everyone on this panel can relate to. I don't think there's anything wrong with being prepared for deepfakes if they're used politically. The fakes that we've seen that have been used politically and spread like wildfire, and people believe them or they don't, but they're the ones that are like the Nancy Pelosi cheap fake that wasn't actually a deepfake. The one where like Joe Biden's face was being stretched and he had his tongue out, that wasn't really a deepfake. Those are dangerous because we believe them because they're like a confirmation bias thing, but the ones that are being used against women are actually deepfakes. And if people believe them or they don't, it still is a violation of their consent. And I think there's not a super deep answer to why this has happened, even though I keep asking it. I just speaking only for the US, not internationally, but the political angle is appealing because everyone can kind of relate to it and everyone can choose a side to it. When we talk about sexual harassment and abuse against women, it's always like, well, I have a daughter now, so I care, or I have a sister, and what if that was her? But it's harder to make people care about that sort of thing unless they have a direct connection to it, even though it affects a lot of women. But with politics, you can kind of, especially the way politics are now, and we're coming up on an election, it's just very scary to think about it being manipulated again in a way that's very high tech and is, very public facing in that way.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Samantha. Now we're going to move to Nina Schick, who is a broadcaster and an author specializing in how technology and AI are reshaping politics. Nina is the author of the recently published book, Deepfakes, The Coming Infocalypse. I hope I am pronouncing that right. So Nina, thank you so much for joining us. And I wanted just to start by asking you, how do deepfakes fit into the ecosystem of the Infocalypse?
Well, I basically make the argument in my book, my background is in geopolitics and information warfare, that our information ecosystem has become an increasingly dangerous and untrustworthy place. And that's largely to do with the huge technological advances of the last 30 years, which until now we've kind of hailed as an unmitigated good for humanity without thinking about how this technology is actually an amplifier of human intention. So just as there is good, there's a lot of bad. And we've started seeing that in our crisis of information over the past decade, really. And this was even before the age of deepfakes, where things like cheap fakes, manipulated media, bad information started going viral in a way that wasn't possible, 30 years ago in the analog age. And that's largely to do with kind of the democratization of the creation of content, thanks to technology, as well as this one single information ecosystem where everything can go viral from anyone with immediacy. So you have this increasingly potent information ecosystem that is good for the spreading of bad information. And it is against this backdrop that I consider deepfakes as the latest evolving threat. So they didn't emerge in a vacuum. They are simply the latest tool in what has already become a very dangerous information.
Show up.
Sorry, I'm back.
Okay.
So just, I wanted to mention that I interviewed Sam for my book, and when she first wrote that article, I really sat up and took note. It was 2.5 years ago. I was advising the former NATO Secretary General, and we were looking at information warfare and elections. So I was coming at it from a political angle. And I do think that the coming age of synthetic media has tremendous political ramifications. And yet I also agree with Sam that the first malicious use case of deepfakes is undeniably against women. If you look at the deepfakes that exist today, 90% of them are thought to be in this kind of non-consensual pornography against women. So to me, that is simply another example of how women are on the front line when it comes to threats to civil liberties and privacy. And in this case, I think it's actually far broader than that. It's something that I think is the corrosion of the entire information ecosystem, and something that I think that deepfakes is just going to take one step further.
Thank you for that. I mean, you write in your book that deepfakes, their origins are an undeniably gendered phenomenon, and it's interesting to see that 90% of the deepfake videos are of non-consensual porn. But even when deepfakes have been weaponized against journalists, they came in the form of non-consensual porn. So can you write about a specific example in your book about an investigative journalist from India, Rana Ayub. Can you speak a little bit? Can you tell us the story of this journalist?
Yes, absolutely. And I believe Sam has also written about this instance. And as Sam has marked in her work, this use of sexual violence, non-consensual pornography predated deepfakes. It's just that now with AI, the kind of non-consensual pornography that you can make is, cut above, I think she said, just photoshopping someone's head onto the naked body of a porn star. It, of course, is going to be used as a weapon of silencing oppression. And the use case that you're referring to is this Indian investigative journalist, Rana Ayub, who was quite critical of the ruling BJP in India, the Hindu Nationalist Party. And she had there was a case in which she was very critical of members of the BJP on kind of religious grounds, because it seemed as though they were defending an accused child rapist because he was Hindu rather than a Muslim. And soon she found that there was a deepfake porn video of her that basically went viral in India. It's believed to have come from people close to the BJP. And when the video of her was released, she was also doxxed, so her personal information was released. And pretty soon, I'm South Asian. This was in India, and it went viral across the country, and people were sending her death threats, asking her for her rates for sex. And she's a tough lady. She's used to being in the eye of the storm. And yet something about that attack was so visceral and personal that in her later recounting of the event, she said, I never used to censor myself, but after something like that happened, I started becoming really afraid of kind of doing my own work. So this attack against a female journalist through the use of deepfake pornography, again, I think is a harbinger of how this technology will affect journalists, not only because they can become attacked by this kind of fake content, but also because it increases something called the liar's dividend, right? In a world where anything can be faked, including the visual record, something that until now we tend to see as authentic and true, then everything can also be denied. So before synthetic media or the malicious use of synthetic media is ubiquitous, I actually see the liar's dividend coming into play with immediacy when you talk about harm to journalists.
Thank you very much, Nina. We also want to invite viewers and everybody watching to drop your questions, your comments into the comment section, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, et cetera, and we'll get to them really soon. Next, we have with us Megha Rajagopalan, an international correspondent with BuzzFeed News who covers technology and human rights. A lot of her work is focused on the use of surveillance technology by authoritarian governments. Megha, you recently broke a really big investigative story about China's prison camps and mapped the infrastructure of repression. And I wanted to thank you for your work on that and talk to you really about this interrelated relationship between deepfakes and other data surveillance, facial recognition, harassment of human rights defender issues in general. Like, how are deepfakes a part of this ecosystem of the surveillance state? And also, in your reporting in the last year, how have you seen, this arsenal that authoritarian governments can use against, opposition, human rights defenders, journalists, et cetera? How is that becoming bigger with deepfake being sort of a new tool in that arsenal? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question about the intersection of deepfakes and surveillance tech. The region that I reported on a lot in China, called Xinjiang in the far west, was one of the first places that we started to see facial recognition technology being used in a really widespread way. This is obviously without consent, because no one can consent to being filmed and recognized in a public space. So when you think about deepfakes, there's sort of two sides to that. So like on the one hand, you can see examples of deepfakes being used to evade surveillance technology, particularly face recognition technology. But on the other hand, as Nina pointed out, whenever you have tech like this, the primary risk is abuse by the powerful, and I think that this is also clearly a factor. So to be a bit more specific, so there's two kind of phenomena happening in China right now that could easily be altered by the presence of deepfakes. So one is this issue of kangaroo courts and just like trials for people based on their membership in a particular ethnic group, linking them to things like ideological extremism or terrorism charges. There are trials that happen in many of these cases, and there is evidence brought forth. But when you have the possibility to fabricate visual evidence, it creates incentives and tools for prosecution, for any kind of third-party group that has an interest in this to doctor evidence in cases like this. And another thing that we've seen a lot in China is the rise of forced confessions. So forced confessions are not really a new thing, but it's interesting to see how they've evolved as technology has evolved, right? So like, before the internet, this was largely something you would see on state television. Now you'll see it a lot more in ways that are kind of more accessible to people who primarily get their news on social media. When I first started reporting in China around 2012, 2013, it was really standard whenever you got a politicized case, you would see eventually the defendant in this case in a prison jumpsuit giving what would clearly look like a forced confession, using very stilted kind of party language and that sort of thing. Now what you'll see a lot of times is on top of forced confessions, you'll see Chinese state media and other actors on the internet, after there is for instance, like after there's this big Western media story written about a member of a certain family being sent to an internment camp, Chinese state media will then go and interview the family who says like, oh, no, actually everything's fine. And a lot of times this is understood to be a situation where the family is not, able to express themselves, with their free will. And, even this week, I talked to someone whose family is currently in this situation. So thinking about that in the context of deepfakes, like how much more powerful would it be if it was possible to completely fabricate those conversations, particularly in an environment where the media is already heavily censored and heavily constrained?
Yeah, and you would imagine that the reason for that, I mean, that becomes its own propaganda tool, those videos, they're not intended for the judges or for the actual legal system, but for, the general public to consume or people in China to consume, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you, Megha. So I want to invite viewers again to drop your questions in the comment section, and we're going to get to them really shortly. I wanted to go back to you, Sam, and ask about, in the 3 years you've reported a lot also about what different platforms and media companies are doing as a response, in response to these deepfakes. How are they succeeding? How are they failing? And can you talk to us a little bit about detection versus authentication, some of the two ways that, folks are trying to, regulate the deepfakes on the social platforms?
Yeah, sure. So right after the deepfake story broke, platforms kind of scrambled to figure out what they were going to do with this new thing, especially since they were getting a lot of heat from the media. There was suddenly a lot of attention on their terms of use around things like non-consensual pornography and stolen images and things like that. So immediately after, when it was like in the news every single day, platforms started to get better about moderating things like gender-based violence. A few took down forums that were focused on sharing deepfakes. I think Reddit took down a whole bunch of different subreddits that were dedicated to harassment of women or using images without permission and things like non-consensual pornography, which was great because they identified the problem and not only got rid of the deepfakes subreddit, which maybe would have been too broad of a stroke, but they looked at a lot of different subreddits that were connected to the same idea of using images non-consensually. Discord was another one that did this immediately. We flagged a few different servers to them and said, we never demand that platforms take forums down, but it was just kind of like, here's something that is blatantly violating your terms of service. Why is it on your site? Why are hundreds of people allowed to still do this thing that you say they shouldn't be welcoming to their platform? So they taken a few of those down, but that's an example of kind of, it was very, panicky and like scrambling at the moment. And then when things kind of died down, more of these platforms kind of started letting more things slide, especially on Discord, which you have to have an invite to get into a server. So not a lot of it is public facing, and it's hard to moderate, and they don't want to moderate too heavily, which is, good and bad. So a lot of the stuff came back, especially on Discord, and people started making their own websites dedicated to deepfakes porn. There are a ton of those just on, the open internet now. So yeah, I mean, it's very tricky. It's something that you don't want to push too hard to over moderate. We've seen, like legislation and laws passed through Congress with like FOSTA SESTA was way too broad, and it was supposed to be challenging like sex trafficking and illegal activity like that, but it caught a lot of sexual speech in the process. And that's an example of what we don't want to do with deepfakes is say, we have to crack down on sexual speech on all of these platforms because some of it's bad. So it's a balance that a lot of platforms are still dealing with. Facebook very famously refused to take down a few different cheap fakes and like the lightly edited photos and videos that were fooling people, and those were political. they said, we can't remove this because it's satire, which, you don't want to stifle something like satire because that has a long, important history in American politics. So, yeah, I think it's tough to be too black and white about that. I think a lot of platforms are doing it mostly well, and a lot are just kind of letting whatever go because it's too much. They're moderating huge millions of users, and they can't keep track of it all. So, yeah, the solutions to that are still in the works for a lot of these platforms.
Yeah, it seems like it's a slippery slope, where there's artistry also to these, to these videos, and, where's the line between that? And I think how they're used has a lot to do with it. Nina, I wanted to ask you, how have you seen governments and, regulating the use of this, or not regulating, but, how have they dealt with it when it's come up? You have an example of a not deep fake use in Malaysia in a political election, and sort of a scandal that happened there. And what was the response? Has the government regulated or said anything about deepfakes? And have you seen other examples of other countries trying to do that?
So I would say in general, governments, especially Western governments, have been very slow in dealing with kind of the corrosion of our information ecosystem and our crisis increasingly of mis and disinformation. And I've spent, a decade working with policymakers, and I think largely that is to do with the fact that the evolution of the architecture of our information ecosystem and the associated bad information is so difficult because it's, first of all, it's so new. It's something that a lot of the policymakers it's not something that comes natural to them. And because it also moves across borders. How do you regulate something that doesn't stay within kind of the borders of your country? Going back to what Megha mentioned, I think in general, what I fear when it comes to deepfakes as the latest threat kind of in our evolving crisis of disinformation in the age of information is that it is, I believe, potentially, and I'm going to go down the path that I know Sam finds a bit frustrating, but I think it's an existential threat to liberal democracies, because liberal democracies, in order to function, you need to have some kind of agreement on what is an objective reality, what is the basis of truth. And with this crisis of mis and disinformation, you see it in our increasingly partisan politics. You don't even need deepfakes in the picture. You can already do a lot of damage with cheap fakes and other forms of manipulated media. If you can't agree what objective reality is, then you just simply cannot have a functioning liberal democracy. On the flip side, as Megha mentioned, if you are an authoritarian government, this is wonderful news, because if there is no truth, the only thing that matters is power and who has the narrative to control that power. So when it comes to regulating deepfakes or disinformation, I've been quite alarmed when you see, for example, that China has passed a regulation saying deepfakes are outlawed. So essentially, you're giving the authoritarian state the power to tell you what is real and what is not. And I think that is, at the key of what I find so alarming about what I call our corroding information ecosystem. If you have no basis in what is reality or truth anymore, then it's very difficult to see how you don't slide towards authoritarianism. And kind of my background in that is through Russian information warfare. And to me, it seems that the kind of nature of Russian information warfare, which is all about bending reality, seems to have pervaded the entire information ecosystem to the extent where it's alive and well within Western democracies, but it's also leaking to other domains of life. It's not only in politics, it affects the private sector, it affects private citizens in their lives. And again, this is why I find the case study of women in deepfakes just, such a potent case study of the potential dangers, I think, of what's to come next.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that I think that, when we talk about a crisis of truth, and who has the power, also like who is allowed to use deep fakes and who is not. When we say that, China made them illegal, what does that mean? So that people can make the assumption that there aren't any deep fakes being used, and then who does have the power to use them. So Megha, I wanted to ask you on that note, like, who else should be really concerned about being threatened by deep fakes? We talk a lot, if we step outside like the high profile targets that we talk about, people running for elections or celebrities, who are the other folks that ought to be concerned by this?
Yeah, I mean, I also really find this story of what happened to Rana Ayoub to be really compelling, because it's sort of at the intersection of these two universes in which we talk about deepfakes, like sex and, a person who was like sort of a political figure because of her journalism. And I think that kind of like stigmatizing effect, there's a lot of ways that can replicate itself when it comes to people like journalists and human rights advocates. I worked with a journalist in Myanmar called Aung Naing So, who a few years ago, kind of at the height of the Rohingya crisis, when he was doing a lot of reporting on that subject, there were a number of like huge Buddhist nationalist Facebook accounts that had already taken issue with his work. They found this photo of a guy who kind of had the same build as him and like also wore glasses, standing next to a militant, and they used this to sort of smear him as being a militant. So in a environment where the kind of like trust in institutions, where the kind of information ecosystem was more healthy than it was in Myanmar, it may not have had such a big impact. But in this kind of arena where these issues were already kind of a powder keg and there were a lot of bad faith actors, it ended up with this kind of digital onslaught, which then rapidly escalated into death threats. And he actually had to go into hiding and stop working for a few months, which isn't even that uncommon there. But when you think about something like that, nobody needed a deep fake to do this, right? Like, this was literally just a picture of a guy that didn't even look that much like him, but could be mistaken. So when you add something like, something that looks like direct visual evidence, it becomes a lot more powerful, especially in places where there are lower rates of digital literacy in the first place, and where people don't actually have like news sources that they would consider reliable, might prefer to get their information from social media in the first place. So I think it's interesting when we talk about this in the context of authoritarian societies, because a lot of authoritarian societies have really strong governments. Like China is a very like strong arm kind of government. But if you look at the flip side, in places with really weak institutions, it can actually be just as destructive. And just as we've seen disinformation and misinformation campaigns on Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp give rise to communal violence in places like South Sudan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, lots of other places. Deepfakes are sort of the next layer to that. To me, like the idea that a journalist or a political dissident, a religious leader, somebody like that could have a deepfake video made of them is a lot more threatening and a lot more real than somebody like Joe Biden, which because in the latter case, the person has the power and the credibility to be able to debunk it. But in the former case, there's already, these people are already up against a lot of opposition. And, it's a lot harder to prove your innocence, I think, in that case.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that when you look at, the harm that's been done to people that have been targeted by this, it's really, there's something kind of ineffable in it. But when you look at the case of Rana Ayoub, for example, she stopped writing for a little bit. She censored herself. And I think that's the point. I think that's the point of deepfakes. They cause a very different kind of harm than the shallow fakes, than the cheap fakes, that there is something really profound in what happens. And, I actually read this academic article written by Danielle Keats-Citron. I want to read a quote from it, where she talks about specifically when people are used in non-consensual deepfake porn. She says, Deepfake sex videos involve an invasion of sexual privacy by exercising dominion over individuals' intimate identities, creating a sexual identity not of their making. It undermines the ability to present identities with integrity. They are an affront to individuals' sense of their personalities as their own, that there's something really profound in like this attack on your sense of self, and the damage that's done by that, especially by having a fake that is so real, that is extremely hard to debunk, like you said, when you're not a personality or a public figure, that there is something that is not really quantifiable about what kind of harm it does and what kind of like permanent silencing it might do to people. And I think that's something we're just, sort of trying to find out. And there's no, there's no real legal defense to this yet. And there's no real way to quantify the harm that's been done to folks for them to get redress for it. So I think that's also a part of the challenge. We're actually ready for some questions. So we'll invite Kat Sizek back to read us some of the audience questions. Hey, Kat.
Hey, thanks so much for this amazing conversation. We have one question from YouTube, Tamar Forensics, who's asking, I guess, a tech solve. Is there a tech solve for this? When will it come? Quote, so far, tools for detection of deepfakes are only available for political organizations and press. When do you anticipate that there will be light versions for this general public? So just something about the tech solve. What do you think?
So should I speak to that? So there are various kind of tech solutions being developed. So you're absolutely right that you can kind of build the AI to detect the deepfakes. However, that is not without problems. First of all, the tech is so nascent, even the generation part is so nascent, the detection is a little behind, but there's increasingly more focus on detection. But because of the kind of adversarial nature of the AI behind it, every time you build a detector that's good enough to detect the fakes, the generator gets better as well. So you're potentially in this never-ending adversarial game of cat and mouse where you build a detector, the generator figures out how to get past the detector. The second problem is that it depends also on the kind of data sets that you have to train your detector on, and the kind of detectors that are out there right now have just been trained on data sets that perhaps like Facebook has given out or Microsoft, because they have a compilation of kind of synthetic media. And they're afraid that once they actually put the detectors out there, the people who want to generate them will use that to create more compelling fakes. So there is no silver bullet kind of detection solution, although admittedly, it will be a part of the solution going forward, but you mustn't think that this is the only way that we can detect deepfakes, because it's just going to be one part, or fight deepfakes. It's just going to be one part of the solution.
Anybody else want to speak to that? Okay, we're going to go on. This is a question from the Witness team, our colleagues there. So much of the exposure of wrongdoing globally happens via smartphones, witnessing activists or ordinary people filming. How do you see deepfakes impacting the ability to use these in news and activism? Megha, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's interesting to me. I wish I sort of knew more about this from a legal perspective, because the kind of rise of citizen journalism has presented a lot of like interesting quandaries from the perspective of people who work on international justice and documenting human rights abuses and stuff like that. And we're only sort of now getting to a point where there's a lot of legal scholarship in this area, where, international law is starting to accept a lot of evidence gathered in this manner using cell phones and handheld cameras and stuff like that. And you could see this in the Ayman al-Rafali case, which was recently taken up by the ICC, where they use basically they use YouTube videos that he had posted, on social media as evidence in the case. But when you throw in video that is either doctored or wholly fabricated, it creates a lot of new barriers to trust, not just with the public that may be consuming this information or in the media, but actually in like all kind of other avenues where, this kind of information can be used to try to attain justice. And I guess that's sort of at the core of what Witness's mission and work is about. So I think it's really it's a troubling thing. It's hard to predict, to what extent it's going to impact public trust in these kinds of videos. But I think it's definitely something that has caused me concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And Microsoft is claiming that they can detect deepfakes, but they're also making claims that they can verify, authentic quote unquote videos. So, that's another wrench in the wheel. One last question, and I'll maybe direct this towards Samantha. A lot of platforms are using satire as a reason not to take down videos, and meme makers claim that it's all in fun in satire. How do we draw the line here?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, that's a question that platforms are grappling with right now. I mean, I think that's the line needs to be drawn not so much by, we can't just wait for like a platform to say what's okay and what's not. Ultimately, the conversation needs to be about what we as a society are doing to deal with what Nina was talking about with like what is real and what's not, like this disillusion of like believing what's in the media. And that kind of goes back to the question about cell phones is, we see a cell phone footage in a video and we say, oh, that's definitely real because that's uncut, unedited, like raw from a person. And if deepfakes come into or synthetic media comes into the picture, it's like, well, even that we can't trust. So I think with satire, I think a lot of the satire question is about how much do you trust people to believe what they see. I think a lot of people will still share things and kind of laugh at them and say, look at this crazy video. Even if they know it's fake, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're believing what they see, even if it's a political video. So I think a lot of that has to do with like literacy with the media, vetting your sources. That's something that we do as journalists all the time is, we don't just see a video and say that's definitely what happened. We have to go talk to the people in the video or try to kind of get other angles. So yeah, I'm not sure the satire question is something that platforms can completely answer. I don't think there's a good overarching solution for that. I'm not sure that we would want there to be. So yeah, that's a good question. I think that's maybe the biggest question that we have leading up to the election is what will we be allowed to see? What will platforms kind of censor and push down by an algorithm, and what kind of comes out organically and is actually believable and vetted by the experts like Witness, I guess, and like journalists like ourselves.
Thank you for that, Sam. And we're actually at time. Thank you to all of our panelists, Nina, Megha, and Samantha, for this awesome conversation. It's been really great to be in dialogue with you guys. And I'll turn it back to Kat and Corinne, who can tell you guys about what's next in the Deepfakery series.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Asya. And I just want to say thanks again to all the panelists. I think it's really great to have an all-female panel on this topic, given how disproportionately women are targeted with this, and to have had this conversation that spans really the full range of how deepfakes can be weaponized, from Sam's focus on non-consensual pornography, Nina's background in national security, Megha's fantastic human rights reporting. Yeah, really great conversation, and a way to emphasize the need for networked solutions, because I think, as Nina pointed out, the AI and software is not going to save us from this on its own. So with that, thanks to all of my colleagues at Witness and at MIT. I would also like to thank our sponsor, the Knight Foundation, supporters, BuzzFeed, and Vimeo. And Kat, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. And also thank you to Asya for an incredible perspective, given the work that you have done in terms of the feeling of being watched. of surveillance on individuals and also on communities. So thank you so much. We'd like to also thank you all out there for joining us, and we invite you to join us next week, same time, same place, for episode 5. And we're going to delve into history with an episode called Manipulating Memories, Archives, History, and Deepfakes, featuring Halsey Bergand and Fran Panetta with their new project, In Event of Moon Disaster. Artist James Coop and archivist at Witness, Yvonne Ning. They will be in conversation with MIT professor William Uricchio of Co-Creation Studio at MIT Open Documentary Lab. Here's a quick look, and in the meantime, stay well and see you next week.
My fellow Americans, fate has ordained
that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come
will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind. Good night.